Have you ever wondered why silence can feel more powerful than words? Why in moments of tension, attraction, or even uncertainty, withholding your voice seems to carry a weight that speaking often dilutes? Many women fear silence, believing it might create distance, or worse, push a man away. Yet Carl Jung and other great thinkers understood that silence is not emptiness. It is a force, a container of meaning, and when you embody it consciously, it doesn't repel, it draws deeper. In Jungian terms, silence mirrors the archetype of the wise woman, the one who does not chase approval through constant speech or external validation. She knows that her presence alone speaks. Jung believed much of human interaction is driven by projection, the unconscious act of placing our inner needs, fears, or desires onto another. When you stay silent, you interrupt the usual pattern of projecting onto you. A man is left with himself, his thoughts, his assumptions. He begins to fill the silence with his own meaning. This is where attraction deepens, not in what you give, but in what you hold back. Have you noticed how often you feel compelled to explain yourself, to justify your feelings, or to fill the gaps in conversation so the other person won't misunderstand you? That urge often comes from fear, fear of rejection, fear of being misread, fear of not being enough. But every time you rush to fill the silence, you reinforce the belief that your worth depends on external reassurance. This erodes the very magnetism that Jung would say lies in individuation, the process of becoming whole within yourself. Silence unsettles because it disrupts the habitual dynamic of grasping and giving. Stoic philosophers understood this long before psychology gave it language. Epictetus said that we suffer not from events themselves, but from our interpretation of them. When you remain silent, you allow another person to face their own interpretations. You give them space to reveal their true character, whether they respect your quiet strength or try to manipulate it. Think back to moments when you've spoken too soon, too often, too desperately. Did you notice how your words seemed to weaken your position, even when you were right? That's because speech, when driven by anxiety, exposes insecurity. But silence, when chosen deliberately, communicates self-possession. It tells him, I don't need to prove myself to you. I already know my value. And paradoxically, this restraint creates an almost addictive pull. Jung described the anima and animus as inner counterparts, the feminine within men, the masculine within women. When you practice silence, you activate the man's anima unconsciously. He is forced to grapple with the feminine within himself, the emotions, uncertainties, and longings he may usually suppress. Instead of you chasing him with explanations or affirmations, he now turns inward, wondering about you, thinking of you, trying to understand you. And that curiosity, born from your silence, is far more compelling than any speech you could offer. But here is the deeper truth: feminine silence is not about manipulation. It is not a strategy to get him. It is about stepping into sovereignty. It is about refusing to abandon yourself in the endless scramble for validation. Jung believed individuation required withdrawing projections and owning your inner life. In silence, you reclaim yourself. You resist the compulsion to make him your mirror. You stand as your own reflection, whole and unbroken. Maybe you have felt the ache of overgiving, of pouring out words and energy just to feel close to a man, only to realize later that you lost yourself in the process. Silence becomes your remedy, not as punishment, but as restoration. It allows you to sit with your discomfort instead of demanding he soothe it. It invites you to witness your own neediness without letting it control you. And when you can hold yourself in that quiet strength, something extraordinary happens. You stop chasing, and he starts leaning in. The Stoics called this inner mastery. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily that he could control only his own thoughts and actions, never the responses of others. When you remain silent, you embody this wisdom. You let go of the illusion that you can control how he sees you, and instead, you anchor yourself in how you see yourself. That groundedness is rare. It is magnetic. It creates the addictive quality men feel but cannot quite explain. Notice how this shifts the dynamic: instead of seeking to be chosen, you become the chooser. Silence is not absence, it is presence distilled to its purest form. And that presence tells him something unmistakable, that you are not afraid to walk away, not afraid to be misunderstood, not afraid to exist without his constant validation. And nothing is more intoxicating than a woman who belongs fully to herself. Silence becomes even more powerful when you realize how rare it is in today's world. Everywhere, people are speaking, sharing, posting, explaining, defending. Noise dominates, and with it comes a constant flood of distraction and self-abandonment. Against this backdrop, your choice to withhold words doesn't register as absence, it registers as strength. It disrupts the pattern he expects and forces him to pay closer attention, not only to you but to himself. Jung believed that the unconscious reveals itself in moments of stillness. When you stop filling the space with your voice, you create a mirror in which his unconscious begins to stir. He may not understand why he thinks of you more, why your presence lingers even after you've gone silent. But on a deeper level, he is experiencing projection, the inner drama of his anima attaching itself to you. And this is where the addictive quality forms. It is not your words that bind him, it is the silence that lets his psyche weave its own story around you. Think of the times when you've been afraid of silence in a relationship. Perhaps a man grew quiet, and your mind raced with assumptions. Is he upset? Is he losing interest? Did I say the wrong thing? That spiral of insecurity likely pushed you into over-explaining, into talking more than necessary, into trying to force clarity. But what if instead of reacting to his silence, you allowed yourself to hold your own? What if you trusted that your worth does not rise or fall based on his temporary distance? This is where silence transforms from something frightening into something empowering. The feminine silence Jung points toward is not passive. It is active containment, the ability to sit with tension without collapsing under it. This is what makes it so magnetic. When you choose silence consciously, you embody the archetype of the sovereign woman, the one who governs herself, who does not spill her energy recklessly. Men feel this containment as stability, as mystery, as something they cannot easily conquer. And because it resists immediate consumption, it draws them in deeper. But it's important to see how silence also reveals your own inner wounds. When you struggle to stay quiet, when the urge to explain yourself feels overwhelming, that is your shadow surfacing. Jung described the shadow as the hidden, repressed parts of the self, the fears, the neediness, the cravings we often deny. When you notice how hard it feels to remain silent, you are actually encountering your shadow directly. This is not a failure. It is an invitation to know yourself more fully. Have you ever noticed that the moments when you most want to speak are often the moments when you fear abandonment the most? That impulse is not really about him, it is about you. It is about the child within you who once believed love could be lost unless you performed for it, unless you filled the air with reassurance. When you practice silence, you give that part of yourself a new experience, the experience of being held, not by another, but by your own strength. This is where silence stops being a tactic and becomes a path to individuation. The Stoics would call this practicing temperance, the discipline to restrain immediate impulses in service of something higher. Seneca wrote that true strength is not found in conquest, but in self-mastery. In silence, you are not trying to manipulate him. You are mastering yourself. You are showing yourself that your value does not depend on noise, that your essence does not vanish if unspoken. This mastery is what commands respect. And respect, once earned, is the soil in which real love can grow. Consider how different the dynamic feels when you are silent from a place of fear versus when you are silent from a place of strength. Fearful silence feels like withdrawal. It feels like punishment, or passive aggression, or emotional distance. But empowered silence feels steady, grounded, unshaken. It doesn't shut him out, it invites him in, without forcing him. This distinction is subtle but life-changing. One weakens connection, the other strengthens it. You may find that when you step into this kind of silence, men react in surprising ways. Some become more attentive, more curious, more invested. Others grow frustrated, even defensive. That difference reveals their own level of self-awareness. A man who respects your silence respects your sovereignty. A man who fears it reveals his inability to meet you where you stand. Either way, your silence has done what words rarely can, it has unveiled truth. And this is why silence is addictive to a man. Not because it tricks him, but because it compels him to face parts of himself he usually avoids. It unsettles his habitual certainty and pulls him into a deeper dance. He begins to wonder about you in the quiet, to miss you without your constant presence, to crave the very space that once scared you to hold. Silence doesn't drive him away. It teaches him that your presence is not easily consumed, and that is what keeps him returning. Silence, when chosen consciously, does not merely influence him, it transforms you. The real secret lies in what it reveals about your relationship to yourself. Jung emphasized that individuation requires facing solitude without fear, because only in solitude can you encounter the depths of your own psyche. Silence in relationships is a miniature form of solitude. It is the moment you choose not to escape yourself through constant expression, but to stay with your own presence. Have you ever noticed how difficult it feels to let a pause linger in conversation? That restless discomfort is not about the other person, it is about you. It is the fear of being unseen, the fear that if you do not perform, you will vanish from significance. But when you can hold the pause, when you can sit inside that discomfort without breaking it with words, you learn a vital lesson: you are significant even without constant performance. This is the foundation of feminine sovereignty. The Jungian archetype of the lover teaches us that love must begin within. When silence feels unbearable, it is often because you have not yet learned to love your own company. The moment you can sit in silence and feel at peace, you free yourself from dependency. And from that freedom, your presence becomes magnetic. A woman who does not fear her own silence signals that she does not fear abandonment. She does not chase validation because she has already validated herself. That quiet confidence is intoxicating, not because it manipulates, but because it embodies truth. From the Stoic perspective, silence is a form of abstinence. Just as the Stoics abstained from indulgence to strengthen character, your abstinence from unnecessary words strengthens your spirit. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily that much of what we speak is unnecessary, and that restraint clarifies the mind. Your silence becomes a mirror of his own inner state. If he feels restless, it is his restlessness. If he feels calm, it is his calm. You no longer absorb responsibility for his reactions. You let him encounter himself through you. This shift is radical, because so often women are conditioned to manage emotional climates. You are taught to smooth over awkwardness, to reassure, to explain, to keep harmony alive. But harmony achieved through self-abandonment is false harmony. It erodes trust, because it hides your true self. Silence restores authenticity. It says, I will not perform to soothe your discomfort. I will allow both of us to sit in reality, even if it feels uncertain. That is not cruelty, it is integrity. Perhaps you can remember a time when your silence revealed more than words ever could. Maybe you withdrew from explaining, and he noticed. Maybe he became more attentive, more eager to understand. Or perhaps he revealed his insecurity, unable to handle your quiet. In either case, your silence told the truth. It showed you who he was, and it showed you who you were becoming. Jung warned of the dangers of projection in love, that we often fall for the reflection of our inner wounds rather than the reality of the other. Silence interrupts this cycle. When you are quiet, you cannot project as easily, nor can he. Instead, the projections rise into awareness. You see the neediness you wanted him to soothe. He sees the longing he wanted you to fill. If both can face these projections consciously, the relationship matures. If not, the silence exposes what words would have concealed. This is why silence is not about withholding affection or playing games. It is about living in truth. It is about resisting the compulsion to rush past discomfort and instead letting it illuminate what is real. This truth-telling quality of silence is what makes it so compelling. A man feels it, even if he cannot explain it. He senses that you are not simply withholding words, you are embodying a strength that does not depend on him. That strength creates the paradox: the more you do not need him, the more deeply he wants to know you. You may feel a kind of fear rise up as you consider embracing this silence. That fear is natural, because it challenges the old patterns of seeking love through effort, through explanation, through constant giving. But Jung would remind you that what you fear most often contains your greatest treasure. The shadow is not your enemy. It is your doorway to integration. By practicing silence, you integrate the parts of you that once believed you were only valuable when speaking, when pleasing, when proving. The Stoics echoed this in their belief that adversity is training for the soul. Choosing silence when every fiber of your being wants to grasp for reassurance is not easy. It feels like a battle. But that very battle strengthens you. Each time you hold the silence, you prove to yourself that you can survive without his immediate approval. You discover that you are not as fragile as you once believed. And that discovery shifts everything: your confidence, your presence, your magnetism. Silence, then, is not the absence of communication. It is communication of the highest form. It says, "I am here, whole, grounded, sovereign. I do not beg. I do not chase. I choose to remain." This kind of silence cannot drive away the man who is meant to walk beside you. It only draws him closer, because it speaks to the deepest part of his psyche, the part longing for a woman who is not consumed by him, but complete within herself. The longer you sit with the reality of feminine silence, the clearer it becomes that its true impact is not measured by his response, but by your own inner shift. A woman who no longer fears silence is a woman who has reclaimed her boundaries, her worth, and her sovereignty. And ironically, it is this very reclamation that alters how men experience her. They feel the difference between a woman who speaks from insecurity and one who chooses when to speak because she is already rooted in herself. Carl Jung understood that much of what we call relationship struggles is really an unconscious attempt to avoid our own inner work. We grasp for words, affection, or validation because we are trying to escape the silence within ourselves. But when you embrace silence, you interrupt that cycle. You face yourself honestly. This is why silence feels so addictive to men: it carries the weight of self-possession, and that weight cannot be faked. Consider the times when you found yourself explaining, persuading, or pleading with a man. Were those words truly for him, or were they an attempt to quiet your own anxiety? Most often, it is the latter. We speak not because the other person needs clarity, but because we need comfort. Yet the irony is that these words rarely bring comfort, they create dependency. The more you explain, the more you reinforce the belief that you must earn your place. Silence disrupts this belief. It teaches you that you do not need to earn what is already yours: your worth, your presence, your right to exist without justification. The Stoics often reminded themselves that true freedom is internal, not external. Epictetus taught that what enslaves us is not other people, but our own compulsions. The compulsion to fill silence is one such chain. When you break it, you experience a new kind of freedom. And in that freedom, you no longer chase approval, you invite it naturally. Men are drawn to this energy not because it manipulates them, but because it signals that you are free from the grasping that so often dominates relationships. Have you noticed how attraction often fades when one person becomes overly available, overly predictable, overly verbal about every thought and feeling? That predictability kills polarity. Silence restores it. It creates space for curiosity, for wondering, for longing. Jung would call this engaging the unconscious. A man cannot help but project his anima onto you in that silence. He imagines, he fantasizes, he questions. And in that process, he feels more connected, not less. But here is where your work deepens: silence is not always comfortable. It will bring up your fears of abandonment, your memories of not being heard, your longing to prove your value. This is shadow work in its rawest form. When those emotions rise, you might feel an almost irresistible urge to break the silence, to run back into the old pattern of explaining and justifying. Yet if you can hold steady, you will notice something powerful: those emotions lose their control over you. You discover that you can feel the fear without acting on it. That discovery is liberation. The more you practice this, the more silence becomes not a tool but a natural state of confidence. You do not withhold words to achieve a reaction. You simply no longer need to overuse them. Your presence speaks louder than your speech. And that presence is what creates the addictive pull men feel. It is not about mystery for mystery's sake, it is about the authenticity of a woman who no longer betrays herself by spilling out words she does not need to say. This is why silence separates the transient from the enduring. A man who is only seeking distraction will grow restless in your quiet. He will try to provoke, to pull, to demand more. And when he realizes you will not perform, he may leave. But this is not a loss, it is clarity. Silence exposes truth. The man who remains, the one who leans closer, who respects your sovereignty, is the man who is drawn not to your compliance but to your strength. Do you see the paradox? The very thing you once feared, that silence would push him away, becomes the filter that protects you from men who cannot handle your wholeness. Silence does not drive away love. It drives away dependency, manipulation, and illusion. What remains is real connection, born not of constant reassurance, but of mutual respect and attraction. In Jungian psychology, individuation is the goal of life, the integration of shadow and self, the emergence of a complete being. Silence plays a vital role in this process, because it forces you to stop scattering yourself outward and instead turn inward. You meet the parts of yourself that once sought to be hidden. You learn to hold them with compassion. And from that integration, you emerge not as a woman begging to be chosen, but as a woman choosing deliberately. The Stoics would call this alignment with nature. To them, wisdom meant living in accordance with truth, not fantasy. Silence aligns you with truth. It strips away the fantasy that you can control love through constant expression. It reminds you that all you truly control is yourself, your words, your choices, your presence. And when you live from that truth, you no longer fear silence. You welcome it. You understand its power. So when you notice the tension rise, when you feel the urge to break the quiet with unnecessary explanation, pause. Not to manipulate him. Not to play games. But to remind yourself that your worth exists independent of his response. That reminder is the essence of sovereignty. And sovereignty, once embodied, is the most irresistible force a woman can carry. Silence also reveals the hidden patterns of attraction and attachment that so often go unnoticed. Many relationships are built on a cycle of pursuit and reassurance. One person fears losing the other, so they overgive, overspeak, and overexplain, while the other grows distant, retreating into themselves. This dance can become addictive, but it is not true intimacy. Jung would say it is a projection loop, each person trying to heal their own wounds through the other. Silence interrupts this cycle. It brings the unconscious dynamic into the light. Have you ever felt that rush of panic when a man pulls away, when his messages slow down or his attention shifts? That panic is rarely about him in the present moment, it is about the past. It is the echo of childhood experiences, of moments when love felt uncertain or conditional. In that silence, your nervous system remembers. And your impulse is to fill the gap, to reach out, to make sure you still matter. But when you resist that impulse, when you hold your own silence instead, you create space for healing. You show yourself that you can survive the uncertainty, that love is not a performance you must constantly maintain. This is where feminine silence becomes transformative. It teaches you not only about him, but about yourself. It reveals your triggers, your patterns, your unmet needs. And instead of outsourcing that healing to him, you begin to integrate it within yourself. This is individuation in practice, owning your projections, withdrawing them from him, and facing the truth of your inner life. Each time you do this, you grow stronger, steadier, more whole. From the Stoic view, this is resilience. Seneca wrote that a person who masters themselves is greater than one who conquers the world. By mastering your response to silence, you build resilience in the face of uncertainty. You no longer collapse when he withdraws. You no longer rush to fill the emptiness with words or validation. You learn to hold yourself in the absence, and in doing so, you discover that you are unshakable. Men feel this shift. They sense when your silence comes from fear, and they sense when it comes from sovereignty. Fearful silence pushes them away because it is heavy with expectation. Empowered silence draws them closer because it is light with freedom. He feels the difference between being responsible for your emotional state and being invited into your grounded presence. The first is a burden, the second is a gift. This is why feminine silence can feel addictive. It is not the silence itself, but what it represents. It represents a woman who is not enslaved by her anxieties, who does not collapse into over-explaining, who trusts herself enough to hold the space. That kind of presence is rare. It is unforgettable. It lingers in his mind because it reflects something he longs for within himself, the ability to be whole, to be calm, to be free of constant striving. Think about the most powerful people you've encountered in life. Were they the ones who spoke the loudest, or the ones who carried themselves with quiet certainty? True authority rarely shouts. It does not need to. In the same way, your silence communicates more than words ever could. It tells him that you are not desperate for his attention, that you do not need to perform to earn his affection, that you are already complete. And because wholeness cannot be faked, he feels it instinctively. But silence is not only about attraction, it is also about clarity. When you practice silence, you see him more clearly. You notice how he responds to space. Does he grow curious, attentive, respectful? Or does he grow angry, impatient, dismissive? His reaction reveals his own level of emotional maturity. A man who respects your silence respects your sovereignty. A man who cannot tolerate it shows you that he cannot meet you at your depth. Either way, silence saves you from illusion. It shows you the truth. Jung would say this is the moment when projection dissolves. Without the constant noise of words, you can no longer hide in fantasy. You see him as he is, not as you wish him to be. And you see yourself as you are, not as you perform to be. This clarity can be confronting, but it is liberating. It frees you from chasing shadows and allows you to make choices rooted in reality. And here lies the paradox: the silence you once feared becomes the silence you crave. Not because it distances you from love, but because it brings you closer to real love, the kind built on truth, not performance. You realize that silence is not emptiness but fullness. It is the fullness of your own presence, your own worth, your own sovereignty. When you embody this silence, you do not need to demand respect. You command it. You do not need to beg for attention. You attract it. You do not need to chase love. You choose it. And that choice is what makes you truly irresistible, not the performance of words, but the power of knowing when not to speak. Silence does more than transform your relationships, it reshapes your identity. Jung taught that the psyche seeks wholeness, and individuation is the process of becoming who you truly are rather than who you think you must be. When you stop filling every gap with speech, you encounter the unfiltered truth of yourself. You face the fears, doubts, and insecurities that once drove you to over-explain. And as you learn to hold them in silence, you discover a new kind of power, the power of being unafraid of your own depths. Have you ever noticed how quickly people rush to fill silence in social situations? A pause falls, and someone laughs nervously, changes the subject, or starts explaining. That instinct comes from discomfort with presence. But the woman who can remain silent without collapsing into nervousness radiates authority. She does not chase validation. She does not fear emptiness. She rests in her own being. And that rest is profoundly attractive, not because it is a tactic, but because it is so rare. Men feel this at a visceral level. A woman who embodies silence from strength challenges him to confront himself. In Jungian terms, she awakens his anima, the inner feminine that he often suppresses. Her silence unsettles him because it forces him to engage with emotions, uncertainties, and longings that he cannot easily ignore. And once awakened, this inner dialogue becomes tied to her presence. He finds himself thinking of her, wondering about her, drawn to her without fully knowing why. But the deeper significance of silence is what it gives to you. It returns your energy to you. So much of a woman's exhaustion in relationships comes from overgiving, emotionally, verbally, energetically. You pour out in hopes of receiving love in return, but in the process, you drain yourself. Silence interrupts this cycle. It teaches you to conserve your energy, to stop scattering yourself outward. And in doing so, you realize that your worth was never tied to what you give away, it has always been within you. The Stoics saw this clearly. They believed in guarding one's inner life with discipline, refusing to let external chaos dictate internal peace. When you embrace silence, you practice this discipline. You say to yourself, I do not need to control his response. I do not need to perform to be loved. I only need to remain anchored in myself. This detachment from outcome is not coldness, it is strength. It frees you from dependency and allows you to enter relationships as an equal, not a beggar for affection. Think about the difference between a woman who begs to be heard and a woman who knows her silence is enough. The first lives in fear of rejection. The second knows that if her presence is not enough, no amount of words will ever make it enough. That conviction is what makes silence magnetic. It reveals a woman who belongs to herself, who does not collapse into the old patterns of neediness or fear. And that belonging is what men find so compelling, because it represents the very wholeness they long for within themselves. But here is where Jungian psychology goes deeper, silence also confronts you with your shadow. When you withhold words, you meet the parts of yourself you once tried to hide, the desperation for approval, the terror of abandonment, the fear of being invisible. This confrontation can feel unbearable at first, but it is the doorway to transformation. Only by facing the shadow can you integrate it, and only by integration can you become whole. Each time you hold silence without fleeing, you integrate another fragment of yourself. You step closer to the woman you were meant to be. And here lies the paradox, the more you embrace silence, the less you need it as a strategy. It ceases to be a tool for attraction and becomes a natural expression of sovereignty. You no longer calculate when to speak and when to stay quiet, you simply rest in your truth. Sometimes you speak, sometimes you do not, but either way, your words are no longer driven by fear. They flow from choice. And it is that freedom of choice that radiates power. A man senses this immediately. He knows when a woman's silence is a weapon and when it is an embodiment of peace. The first creates distance, the second creates respect. And it is respect, not manipulation, that makes love last. Respect born of silence tells him that you are not desperate for him, that you do not fear his absence, that you choose to be there. And because he feels chosen rather than needed, his bond with you deepens. Silence then becomes not just a force in love, but a foundation for life. You learn to trust yourself, to hold your ground, to resist the urge to chase what is not aligned. You become a woman who does not collapse when faced with uncertainty, but who sees uncertainty as an invitation to strength. This transformation is not just psychological, it is spiritual. It is the journey Jung described as individuation, and the Stoics described as freedom, becoming whole, becoming sovereign, becoming free. And so the silence you once dreaded becomes the silence you cherish. It no longer feels like emptiness. It feels like abundance, abundance of presence, of strength, of clarity. It does not isolate you from love. It brings you into the kind of love that is real, because it is chosen, not begged for. The woman who embraces silence becomes unforgettable. Not because she withholds to manipulate, but because she embodies a strength that cannot be shaken. She becomes the woman who does not need to chase, who does not fear loss, who knows her worth without question. And that kind of woman does not repel love. She attracts it, naturally, effortlessly, irresistibly.